Welcome to Software Without Borders. I'm your co-host, Jared Striner. Here with me is my trusty co-host, Andy Hilliard, CEO of Accelerants. Today, we're diving into a game-changing topic, turning product teams from order takers into proactive problem solvers. Today with us is Michael Marmor. Michael's a venture partner and consulting Fractional CTO, focused on companies and teams that make software products. He leverages 30 years of experience working with clients and investors to hire, scale, and mentor software product development teams worldwide. He is formerly the head of software engineering at Anglo American, one of the world's largest mining companies. He's also a founder and investor in software startups. Interestingly, he's lived in India and Bhutan for 15 years, building and managing software teams, and he currently lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, where he runs consulting practice. Today, he's sharing with us how to unlock your team's full potential. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jared. It's great to be here.
Michael, with your extensive experience in outsourcing and scaling remote teams, what initially sparked your interest in this field and what keeps you motivated?
Gosh, so I have a long history. I've come from a software engineering background. So I started out in my career writing code, and I've kind of worked through all the various parts of the software process, building teams, running my own software company. And now I mentor software companies, and I also work with venture capitalists who are investing. So I help with due diligence, and I operate as a venture partner when investments are being made, and then mentoring. So I find it fascinating, and I love seeing software projects come together and get to market.
So Michael, you and I have known each other and worked together actually with projects in cross borders, different countries for, 15 years, maybe even longer. And I want to share, hopefully today's episode is going to focus around the evolution of the marketplace and the evolution of you specifically. And what you're doing today. And I guess, we'll share stories about, how we see the evolution of the marketplace as it pertains to us. And since we share so many intersections, I'd just like to understand a little bit about, in your viewpoint, what has evolved.
Yeah, well, thanks, Andy. So first of all, it's great to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity to be on the Software Without Borders show. And, as Jared had said before, I've spent 30 years now working with software teams. And today I'm an independent consultant, and I'm helping software folks get better at their jobs, which is really what I do. So as I said, I come from a software engineering background. I started my first software engineering company in 1996. And today I help early stage founders build and scale software companies. And I also work with larger companies who are trying to modernize their product development approach to stay competitive, especially now that AI and the kind of sky-high expectations of what customers have kind of kick the legs out from under the desks of the software companies that have been operating for a while. So I also work as a venture partner with a micro VC, which means I get to vet companies, I get to conduct due diligence, and I get to mentor the founders. So I guess that's the context.
Are you also a shareholder? I mean, do you take shares in these companies?
So what I do is I invest through a micro VC. So it's a portfolio of companies. So I'm not an angel in the sense of directly investing, but I invest through micro VCs that hold a portfolio. And then there's a percentage of the investments, if they fall into my key areas, where I will step in with a mentoring role. So I have a lot of experience in B2B SaaS. So the companies that are in B2B SaaS, and particularly ones that are in industrial areas, I tend to work with those companies very directly. So I don't take shares, although maybe in the future we'll do that. But at the moment, I'm very active with the VCs directly. Yeah. So look, what I was describing is the context of who I see, right? So I see lots of smaller companies, I see some bigger ones, but in terms of the software landscape and how it's evolving, it depends a lot on the type and size of the companies that we're seeing. And I work with both small and bigger companies. So the thing that's most interesting to me about the small companies that I'm seeing these days is that their game is way, way up. So I started my first software company when I was in my 20s, and I didn't know 10% of what many of the young founders that I work with now, what they know. So these young guys, they've read all the books. They know about product management. They know about the importance of automation. They know about DevOps. And it just keeps getting stronger. And so I really, what's exciting for me and what keeps me going is that I feel like there's never been a better time to start a software company than right now. We have great support from the tools, the knowledge is readily available, and people are ready to move fast. So that's certainly with the smaller companies. Do you see that as well, Andy, with the companies that you're seeing? I feel like things are just moving faster and the companies are getting better and better all the time.
Well, yeah, definitely. Things are moving faster. Knowledge is more easily accessible and shared. I think collective experience of everyone in the industry also adds to that. However, I also see that too much access to knowledge often gives people a false sense of security and control, knowledge without structure and process and metrics and continual improvement and focus and execution don't really amount to much.
Yeah,
I mean, is that?
I would agree to that. Although I'm among the smaller companies, I'm not seeing too much process generally as being the problem, but I'm seeing process related issues when it comes to bigger companies. And the bigger companies I work with, it's a whole nother story entirely. So I see that there's a raised awareness among bigger companies of their need to transform. And when I talk to these companies, they're talking to me about digital transformation, which it's such a cliche and a buzzword, but at the same time, there's so many companies out there that are providing just good enough products, often in an industrial or kind of B2B setting where it's been fine. And suddenly now they have to be much more competitive given the landscape. So for the larger companies, I'm often brought in to fix problems that's become, nearly existential with the team. And, what I'm hearing is often about too much process when I talk to the big companies. I don't know if that's been your experience as well.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, the competitive landscape is changing so much faster than it ever has been, and the level of knowledge is so much greater. The level of experience is so much greater. That being said, I think that there's this mentality of access to knowledge allows people to have more control and power to do things that are outside of their own individual or entity-led capabilities, and people are too much DIYing it because they have the power and the confidence to do so, and that can often lead to a lot of problems around focus, around expertise, around structure for it to all work together more harmoniously.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. Maybe I shouldn't say structure and process. I should probably say something like dogma, right? Because I feel like there are companies that are following what they believe are some agile process. It's in a book somewhere, and they're trying to follow it to the letter, and they're failing to actually communicate with each other and to communicate with the client. And so they're going through all these movements. So I'm often in companies that are following a process sort of blindly, and they have some structure, but it's not the right structure for them. So I try to be as dogma free as possible when I talk to my clients. I try to avoid frameworks for the most part. And particularly, we try to identify what I would call nonsense processes. Scaled Agile is a great example of what I think is a nonsense process. It's not particularly in the context of creating software products, right? I have to say that most of the companies I work with are trying to create products very different from an internal IT project or an enterprise project within a company. So I tend to focus on team topologies a lot with those kind of companies, which basically is creating a cross-functional team and really empowering that cross-functional team to own what it is that they're working on. And I find that's a real process buster, right? It tends to break open the processes when you start getting the people that have the technical knowledge more engaged with the actual business problems.
Michael, it's very interesting with your background living in India and Bhutan and now back in the States. And have you seen, the other, this is Software Without Borders, right? So we're across the world. Did you see when you were there, the growth of their technology and the things that they were doing, differently than what was happening here in the US, where they were starting from maybe a non-starter area where we had a small little bubble of okay, SaaS is now starting to grow. And I used to work for a company that was B2B SaaS, and at one of our big events, they had the floppy, big blown up, floppy disk of the original, first round of software where oh, we weren't a SaaS company. You know how to load this? You need a floppy disk. And, the thing is, remember finding a 5 3/4 inch floppy at one of the companies, and it says, okay, who knows what this is? Because I know my kids, if I hold it up, that's the save symbol. They don't know what it is. So it's interesting to know at a different part of the world that's starting to, I know India has grown a lot with software development and technology. Bhutan, it'd just be very interesting to hear, some stories from some of your time there.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stories from that time period. So the first thing you need to know is that I started a software company in 1996 in New York City, and we grew that to about 200 people. And it got to the point where we needed to hire more engineers to build the product that we were making. And New York turned out to be very limiting at the time because of Y2K. This was 1999 at the point when we hit a scaling point. And that I was getting calls constantly from offshore companies that wanted to be partners and that wanted to get us to outsource to them. And those were, the usual suspects like Wipro and Infosys, and Satyam at the time was still around, and all of these companies. TCS, back when it was called Tata. And, I've ended up going out to India and meeting with these companies and felt it was such a huge opportunity to build something that I ended up not working with any of those companies that had been calling. Instead, I ended up setting up my own office in Hyderabad, where they were setting up an area called High Tech City. And it was great. Everybody was very enthusiastic, but it was really early days. And at that point, the idea of working with a US company was really a dramatic and exciting thing for a lot of Indian people to do. Right now, things have changed so dramatically. Now there's been a complete reversal. Whereas for the last 20 or more years, for the most part, people are hiring educated, skilled technology labor out of India to work on products that are largely not based in India. There's now a complete reversal where I see people in India building SaaS products with their own knowledge and their own not only technical knowledge, but business knowledge and business relationships that they're selling as SaaS products that they want to run out of India. And rather than Americans going to India like I did to try to get products worked on, now we see Indians coming to the US to find talent that they may be lacking in India. So it's kind of a flip-flop. And I feel like I've seen such a dramatic change in terms of their ownership and the companies I work with. They've just been fantastic.
Yeah, I worked through a Y2K remediation for a company, and I just remember those days where it's like, okay, guys, we had to replace like machines and do all this. We had this whole battle plan. So that kind of brought me back to one of those early days in tech when they like everyone was freaking out about Y2K, and it turned out to be nothing, which was fantastic.
I'll tell you though, Jarrett, there's some things I learned from my time, even back then in 1999, that are still great lessons about software outsourcing. And I feel like those are things that have served me well, that have not changed in the many years. And it might be interesting to talk about that and to see whether Andy agrees with me that those things are still issues today. And I guess the first is that to get the most out of an outsourced software development team, you really have to be deliberate. You have to build alignment. You have to build accountability. You have to have a very effective collaboration. And those things have not changed. And in fact, as things have become more complicated, and there's often larger teams or multiple teams that are working in a complex topology, setting clear expectations and goals where it was super important when the Indian team had no context, it's even more important now when you're asking the developers to actually understand the problem space, to really understand the business, and then to be able to innovate rather than being handed a roadmap and saying, do these things on the list. Because wherever possible now, we try to get away from giving someone a roadmap, and instead we give them the business context. But I feel like that communication bit is the same or maybe even more important, now. Would you agree, Andy?
Yes, but I have a clarifying question. When you say the developers, to what extent is it the developers versus the bridge or the framework between the developers and the client or the product owner, down through the product ownership, the program management, the project manager, and the solution architecture, and all of that layer in between the development group and the client themselves? you can add on top of the client, you can add stakeholders, and shareholders and other things. But like what I'm seeing and what has evolved in our industry is the fact that there's always been this issue between having this binary relationship between a development organization and the client, and both parties sort of taking a half-assed approach at bridging or communicating or creating a structure of leadership and accountability, the bridge in between the two. There's always been this gap because you're asking a lot of development organizations to stretch into an area that is slowly diluted because they're really good at development, but they're not necessarily good at all these pieces in between. And the client is also like outside of their comfort zone in trying to, be the glue and the collaborator. Maybe there's not even a framework for that or a structure around that. I find that even more present today because honestly, over the last 5 years, the number of software service providers has gone from like 10,000 to 30,000. Why is that? It's because you can flip a switch and clone a site and become a software service provider overnight. You don't even need to have full-time employees. You don't need to be co-located. They could be distributed. You can say that you could do everything on the planet because essentially there's resources that can do everything on the planet. So you might as well say you can do it. But the best of the best are now being acquired or consolidated or merged into other larger service providers, but that leaves a more commoditized, base of talent, and that even makes that communication bridge even more, of an issue.
Yeah, no, that's
it's always been
Andy. It's a $10 million question, right? Because so much flows out of it. I feel like I could talk all day about
that's
this.
Your job, right? That's for who you are.
It gets to the root of what I feel like is what's needed. So, I've mentioned team topologies, a couple things. That's a core element of what you're talking about. I've mentioned empowered teams a few times, and I feel like that's another core element. So for me, the heart of successful product development is in empowering product teams. And I'm talking about products differently from IT projects and other things, because I think it actually makes a difference in how things are managed. But the key thing is that the team that is working on it, the full team that's working on a product, needs to own both the problem and the solution. And I find that too many organizations still treat product teams as feature factories, and they hand down roadmaps from executives or stakeholders. And then as a result, the teams become order takers rather than problem solvers. So what you want is an empowered team that's responsible for understanding the business. They understand the customer. They're trusted to deliver real value through experimentation and learning. And to do that, there's also a technical bit, right? They have to have the technical infrastructure to be able to run those experiments and try things that might fail, right? So I guess
how do you structure that team, and where does the different components in that structure reside?
Yeah. So
who owns that? Who's accountable for that? Who's responsible?
Yeah, I have very strong opinions on how that should be done, and they impact outsourcing. So when I've mentioned this word team topologies, what I mean is it's a way of talking about cross-functional teams and how they're put together and who works on the pieces of a larger multi-piece software system. So when I say team topologies, I'm usually talking about what I call the core product team. And then there's the extended team that supports them. So all together in one place, you've got this troika of 3 skill sets. And they are the product manager, the product engineer, and the product designer. Those are, in my mind, the 3 key roles that you must have to have a successful product development team. Now, sometimes in very small teams, somebody might be doing more than one role. But if somebody is both the product manager and the product engineer, they need to be aware that they're playing 2 different roles, and they need to structure their time in such a way where they can play both of those roles. And a key part of it, and this comes back to your original question about communication, Andy, is that you need these 3 skills. They need to be able to sit next to each other, and they need to be physically co-located together. I know I'll probably get hate mail for that, but at the end of the day, what matters for that core team is that they're able to work together very closely. And the supporting team is where outsourcing tends to come in the way that I like to do it. But that team, even the outsourced team, must be exposed to the problem that they're trying to solve and not just working from Jira tickets. So let me just pause there a second, because these roles of product manager, product engineer, and product designer, is that a familiar sort of paradigm to you? Because that's who I see driving. And I like those people to be employees, full-time employees, ideally working for my clients.
working from the client side.
Correct. So ideally, those are full-time employees.
And where is the handoff? Where's the product owner? Are they on the partner side? I mean, who is the bridge, the accountable above and beyond, project manager? Who is on the service provider side to make sure that this translation from designer, engineer, and product manager gets channeled efficiently and effectively, and then empowers the development team itself?
Well, I find there's a lot of different ways to do that, and there isn't necessarily one solution. What matters to me, and what I've seen is the most important factor, is that you're covering the product manager role. Now, the product manager spends 50% of their time out with customers, maybe more, and then they're spending the other 50% of their time with the engineer and the designer working on potential solutions. The product engineer is making sure that there's feasibility for the things the product manager is interested in doing. So the product manager needs to be very clearly communicating the context to that supporting team. And the product engineer, so often in a lot of big companies, it's the engineer that will have the technical team below them. And I find that typically creates silos and poor communication, because it ends up just being an engineering level of discussion, which is the way we used to do it, 10, 15 years ago. Now we need a more full contextual amount of information about what they're doing. So it needs to be, honestly, the combination, the product manager, the product engineer, and the product designer, they're the ones that are communicating it. Now, on the partner side, there can be a bunch of different ways to support that depending on the structure, but I don't put a product owner in place. I make sure that this troika is there. And in a big company, you might have multiple teams that have this troika of 3, and then there's someone who's head of product who everybody else would be reporting to. Does that make sense?
So it definitely makes sense, and I really like the model. In fact, I'll share a little anecdote, little personal information that my daughter happens to be a senior product manager at a San Francisco software company called Checker, and she's not classically trained. In fact, was there even classically trained product management as of more than a few years ago? I mean, there's a lot of content out there. There's a lot of learn as you go out there. But even she mentions, and I hope it doesn't get her in trouble, that most companies just have an amalgamation of people who somehow find themselves in the product management function that are not classically trained. And to the point at the very beginning of this podcast about there's so much information, so much ways to get trained, and you don't necessarily need to take a linear route to do that. I mean, in fact, it might behoove someone to be a better product manager if they have a variety of different exposures and in different functions, right? It could be marketing, it could be sales, it could be somewhere else, in the ecosystem of the industry that you're working in. So I guess my question to you is, and this gets back to my point, is focus and expertise and structure. I see a lot of clients and service providers trying to make people wear hats that are not intuitive or appropriate for people to serve different roles, and that often leads to just inadequacy in the relationship and the outcomes. Is that something? How would you address that?
Well, I think I think it does get back to this definition of product manager, like what you were describing, and to me. So the one other thing is that when it comes to corporate hierarchy or business, the product manager, product engineer, and product designer are at the same level in the company. The product manager is not the head of the product. They're not in charge of the product. They're a functional team that works together. That said, product management is a very new discipline. Project management has been around since we've been building houses, right? But product management has not been formalized, and there is no playbook. There's starting to be, I would say over the last 3 or 4 years, we're starting to get some examples from the hyperscale companies that have put a lot of money into figuring out how to do this. And that has trickled down in a way to becoming more of a discipline. But product management is kind of a new thing. Lots of people do it differently. An important thing in the product managers that I like to see is that they're not necessarily a subject matter expert in the software they're working on. Yeah, it's really, in fact, if they have to learn and ask questions and work with subject matter experts, they will often be a lot more empathetic and understand more about what they're trying to do than if they came in it as an expert. And I've seen that many times. And there's no playbook for product manager. So I feel pretty strongly that another test actually is that the product manager should be able to become the CEO of the product company, right? This is another way of looking at it. The kind of skill set that goes into becoming a good product manager is very similar to the skill set that goes into becoming a CEO. And so often in the best companies, the product, if you're talking about a company where it's like, one product, they're primarily focused on doing one thing, that product manager should be heir apparent to leadership of the company. And if they're not really the right persona to be able to do that type of job, they're probably not the right person to do product manager. Because for me, product manager, it's one of these jobs. It's a huge number of hours. It's more than a full-time job to be a product manager. And when I see startups where the product manager is also the designer and maybe also the engineer, I usually tell them they can do that for a few weeks. But if they're going to get any traction at all with their product, they have to very quickly decide which of the roles they want or bring in other people to do it, because it really is a huge job being a good product manager.
So true.
That being said, chief cook and bottle washer, right? Looking at that as a whole, so what are some key indicators that a product team is being treated more as an order taker rather than a problem solver when they get all these things kind of thrown in their lap?
Gosh, there's a bunch of things. I think the main one, so I like to do a process where there's this team of three, and they run in parallel with the development of the product. And there's a name for this, but it's skipping my mind. But basically, they are out. This team of three is learning about what they're building. They're building tiny prototypes. They're talking to customers. And when they're really, really clear on what it is, what to build, they're able to come to the team and they show the team what it is they want to do. And that team can begin building it. And then the team of three goes out and begins that process in parallel. And there's this kind of handoff along these two parallel tracks that are running. And I feel like the trick and the answer to your question you're asking is getting the supporting team, as I'm describing it, into the role of owner of that problem. Because the entire team can't be meeting with the customer every day, right? This just doesn't make sense. Yet they need to feel empowered. They need to understand what they need to do to such an extent that they're able to run lots of experiments and try out ideas to try to fit whatever the current engineering that's available today to that particular problem. And that kind of takes care of it, right? If you're able to get that team and provide them with the infrastructure, provide them with the business context, and keep that going, I feel like that solves the problem. I don't know if you guys would agree with that, but I look at it a little bit differently.
Well, I think it's giving the power to the team to be able to do that, because I think sometimes when they're in that mode of we're just taking orders, we have this work to do, and as Andy calls it, the GSD list, that they don't feel they have any power, that they're there to check boxes. And I feel that sometimes when they feel that they're okay to speak outside of checking the boxes and doing the work, when they feel they have a voice, that they're able to expand what they're doing. And I mean, I know Andy probably has a ton of examples. I've had it where I did GSD and it was not a fun experience. And you felt like I just have to get all this stuff done. And then once you can speak up and kind of I think you become more as an integral part of the team when you're able to have a voice in the work. And it's not just, checking that box.
Jared, it's something that Andy said early on when he talked about defining clear success metrics, or you said something to that effect, Andy, about knowing. So I think the idea of focusing on outcomes rather than output is a good way. If you can keep that in mind, that's something that works. I think avoiding micromanaging, particularly of that outsourced team, on how they develop the product. You ought to allow them to have, if they're assuming you've hired really competent people, right? That's a given. They have to be competent. Then you can allow them to decide how to avoid micromanaging. And instead, it's the job of that, again, team of three, or however you've structured it, the people that are figuring out what needs to be done, to define clear success metrics. And then let your team figure out the implementation details. So long as they deliver the outcome that we're looking for and that works for the business and that's ethical and all the things that we can kind of lay down as metrics, they can solve the problems however they want. And, like an example on my side would be if you needed a more scalable system, focusing on performance metrics like response time or uptime rather than dictating specific technical approaches, it's a much better way to do this. Let people figure out how to get to that uptime. But if you're dictating the technical approach, that means you're not giving the team the ability to focus on outcomes, which is, I think, what you need to do.
Yeah. Hey, Michael, I know every case is different, and I know sometimes you're going into hire, mentor, and scale. Sometimes you're going into mentor and scale, and not necessarily hire, or maybe scale and mentor. Depends on where the evolution curve is when you come in. But do you have like what do you do in the first 30 or 60 days? Like, how do you grasp baseline? How do you baseline things, and how do you like to approach things in a structured manner? Can you describe that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, I tend to come in and do an assessment. And depending, there's different reasons that I get brought in. So, I'll use an example of a client that I wrapped up relatively recently. And they reached out to me, given they've heard about me from some other clients, and they were having trouble delivering, right? And when I talked to people internally during that assessment, that ended up determining what the approach was, right? So the things I were hearing when I talked to that company is that team members feel like projects go on and on with no end in sight. And product managers can't find time to think about, either to think strategically or to think about the product. They're too busy doing things. And the founders are asking themselves, why can't we get features out the door like we used to, right? That was the case with this company. And so that's a completely different set of issues than if I'm coming into an early stage where they've got a proof of concept that's running and then trying to find product market fit. If they haven't found product market fit and they're very early in the process, it's about how do they decide what to build, what changes do they make for certain markets, and that's a very different type of consulting engagement. But in terms of structure, which is the question you're asking, I like to do assessments. I like to talk to all the different people. I like to look at how software is being developed. I want to spend a lot of time with product managers. And what I'm looking for in almost every case, if it's a product team, is to see if they have those three roles that I've mentioned multiple times here. And how strong is the product manager? What percentage of their time are they spending with customers? What percentage are they spending? Does the designer of the product, and when I say designer, I'm not talking about Photoshop, I'm talking about interactions and knowing the actual use that customers will actually need to engage in to use the product. Is that person regularly talking to the engineering team that's building things, right? Because that's a very important source of information. So I have a certain way of talking to these various components to see if the shape of the team seems appropriate for the thing they're trying to do. And I think a lot stems out of that. And so often what's needed is very different. With this last client that I was working with pretty recently, they were using the cloud like we would have used servers 25 years ago. They had just replicated it in the cloud. They were building things like it was 25 years ago. They hadn't modernized. There was no automation. There was no DevOps. The time it took to deploy a particular product and get it out to customers was like 6 months, right? And my feeling in 2024 is that if you can't deploy your product to production in 2 weeks, you have to stop and retool, because you can't do experiments and you cannot be responsive enough in the market today unless you can get things out within a 2-week period. So a lot of what we did was about automation. We brought in a senior technical leader that was going to try to remove the siloing of technology. And that was the approach. And so far it's been tremendous. We've seen amazing results from the changes that we've made. And in the process, they've discovered a lot of technical debt was created, because what you find is that the more siloed the engineers get and the further they are from the product, the more code that they're writing, which isn't the right code for the actual problem that we're solving. And those layers just build up. And so this company really has a technical debt issue, and they've reallocated a huge percentage of their team on the technical debt, and they're investing in automation, and they're investing in spending a lot more time face to face, which is a key thing that they hadn't really been doing.
Yeah. I want to ask you a question about an area that I feel is just often overlooked and is so critical. It's where the buck stops. It's where the direction comes from, and it doesn't come from product management often. It comes from stakeholders that get out of the shower and come up with new features, or they just want this, they want that. And of course, they're cutting the checks and they're keeping people employed, or they're switching people in and out. How much time do you spend in helping organizations, create a responsible, accountable, logical communication and structure around managing up, managing down, setting expectations, and defining parameters of to not introduce chaos or I guess chaos into what ultimately is a product development ecosystem.
Are you talking about large companies that have many different teams and different initiatives, or are you talking about smaller companies that might have a single product? Because I feel like the answer is completely different.
Well, I mean, I was kind of talking about both. I mean, I know that I sometimes introduce chaos because I'm a shiny object person. And if you have an executive team, you have a bunch of shiny object people, and it just disrupts, the direction of the company and the commitment for product management to deliver on what they've been asked to deliver in the first place. And these things are constantly changing. It's like, how do you set expectations? How do you create silos that are not disrupted or in constant flux because of a dysfunction between product management and engineering and design and all the stakeholders that are not coordinated.
Yeah. Let me answer from smaller companies, because I think it's an easier answer that's maybe more consistent. And this is controversial, but the first thing I do is blow up the roadmap. Because the roadmap is the dumping ground for lots and lots of ideas, many of which are probably way out of date. They're not needed by current customers. They're not the most important thing for 2024. They're not. So I feel like if developers see their job as taking tickets from the bottom of the roadmap, we already are making a mistake, because the roadmap is often this dumping ground. So if you blow up the roadmap, what do you do instead? Right? Well, another part of this has to do with like planning sprints, the actual execution of the development. We tend to do that wrong because we're asking software developers and technical people to make technical estimates. And you can't really ask someone to do a technical estimate that has any accuracy unless they're going to create a proof of concept. So if someone is prototyping or proofing something, you can kind of get somewhat accurate, but I don't take any estimates from engineers unless there's a small working prototype that shows that. Instead of that, you turn it on its head and you take a particular period of time, call it like 6 weeks, and your company decides, how much money do we want to spend in this amount of time? So you're limiting what you do to the money that you can invest on certain features. And there's a betting process is often what it's called. I don't know if you're familiar with the shape-up methodology that 37 Signals came up with, but they got some terminology around this where they call it a betting process. There's a pitching process where the product manager effectively says, these are the things that I think we should build. This is the most important way to use the next 6 weeks. And then there's a process of pitching that and reaching some agreement. And then there's a discussion about how much they're willing to spend to get certain things done. And then you set a very clear period of time, and everything that's decided that has to fit within that box must ship. There's no like doing one sprint and then being half done and nothing gets delivered, and then another sprint and everything's half done. You actually come up with something that you can deliver because you build some prototypes to get there. So that's for smaller companies. This is the system that I like. And it starts with blowing up the roadmap and really looking at the constraint of time and engineering and knowing what can be built. Do you feel like that's a reasonable answer to the question you're asking?
No, that's a great answer.
So when it comes to bigger companies, then you get into a lot of much more complex things, because then it gets into the culture of the product company. Why are they making the products? Is the CEO on board with trusting the team to be able to experiment their way through? Because the best ideas that come out of products come from engineers. They don't come from product managers. They don't come from designers. The best ideas come from engineers who are applying whatever the current technology available today is to a particular business problem. And we have to create an environment where that happens. And if you are managing it in the kind of predictive way like Scaled Agile proposes and others, you're never going to get those developers to do that kind of thing. So it starts at the top, and you have to buy into a product-centric model. This also answers a question you'd asked earlier about, like one particular client wants a particular thing, and how do you handle the communication because they want this thing? If you're building a product, what you're building has to work for everybody. And the product manager may make unpopular decisions, but the product has to be viable for the company and not necessarily for one particular client. So they need to take all of that into account in making these decisions and placing the bets. So that often means telling the CEO, no, we're not going to do that. It's not part of our big strategy. So the whole company needs to be on board with this methodology of empowering engineers, empowering product teams.
Jared, let me just, I was going to have you ask the next question, but it did have a follow-on question, semi-related to that. And that is, do you believe the landscape that companies live in now with competition, industries, and I guess investor returns is changing more rapidly? It seems to me that it's changing more rapidly because you have investors that want to increase the IP that is entering a blue ocean that has a hypothetically higher multiple for various investment reasons, and then you have competition that is rapidly producing competitive or slightly better or slightly different products to compete in the marketplace. And the marketplace is changing because of these various dynamics. Is the whole mentality and the way you produce products today, and the speed at which you produce it, and the sort of complexity and scope of which the products exist today, is how much is that changing, and how critical is that to creating a structure for these more rapidly changing dynamics?
Yeah, I guess the answer that I have is maybe one that might surprise most people, because it's actually a technical answer. And it is that teams these days need the ability to deploy tiny bits of code into production extremely quickly. And then they need to be able to experiment and put out little things. And if they don't work, they need to be able to reverse it out in seconds. They need to be able to try things. They need to be able to be extremely nimble. And that is it's a DevOps capability. It requires an end-to-end way of viewing the product. It means that you have confidence in automated regression testing and the way that all of the things work, so that a single developer can take the decision without a complex approval process to put something that they believe is going to solve a problem into production very quickly. And when you have that capability, it opens up the ability to run experiments. It reduces the psychological safety concern that people have about stepping out and maybe doing something that's a mistake, because people are being told, put your ideas out there, let people try it. And then there's of course a bunch of other things. I'm not saying be irresponsible, right? You could hear what I'm saying and say, "Great, you're being irresponsible." No, I'm talking about using feature flags, using test groups, using A/B deployments, using all the modern techniques that are available to be able to very quickly take ideas and get them into the hands of customers. And the reason that this is a technical answer to your question is that, yes, people expect more. I just got a new phone yesterday. I got the latest the latest Google Pixel 9 XL Pro, whatever, the super duper phone, right? And the user experience on it and everything that I'm using on it is superb. I mean, they've spent so much time, and the expectations that I have around any application that I fire up on that phone is going to be that it's just flawless and that it's anticipating the thing I'm going to ask it. And of course, it can parse my voice. And of course, it's going to, the expectations I have now, and I'm in a consumer space, but for somebody that is auditing a billing process for a medical system, and you've got software for that has a 1-year release cycle, and it was written in COBOL, and it's just barely evolving. Those same customers have a phone, and they're used to a higher level of experience. They're used to better. People want more, and I totally understand it as a consumer. I expect more from my car this year than I did 10 years ago, and every other thing I use. So, of course, the lucky part and the good news in all of this is that the technology is there to meet us and to facilitate. And it's there if you can build a cross-functional team that knows how to do things quickly and that knows how to work together. And you've got the kind of cross-functional communication that's necessary to know what to build and then how to build it. And you've got engineers that love to tinker with whatever technology just came out 10 minutes ago. It's those companies that are going to come out first. They're the ones that they're the ones that all the big companies are concerned, because they know they're not going to change their big, slow process when some new startup company is following these hyperscale techniques and is outcompeting everybody because they can. So that's what I see. I find it very exciting. I love working with these small, scrappy companies that are building these products, but I also love working with the big companies that are realizing that everything has to change from the CEO to on down if they want to maintain a prominent position. And we're seeing it with Intel. We're seeing it with many different companies that say the old way is just not going to do it. Not anymore.
Yeah, I'm going to suppress the 10 questions I have for time-based. That you just, I'm thinking Moore's Law, and I'm thinking the product market fit and the people's ability to adapt or to be even taught or exposed to and digest before additional, features and are introduced. But anyway, don't have time to go into that. I can always invite you back.
Great. It's Jared's floppy disk. I was just thinking back to that. Right? When I was in India, every night we would use FTP to send our code back to the headquarters in New York. And there was a particular time at the end of the workday where we say, okay, guys, everybody have your code ready. We're going to use FTP and send it to the server. And I remember on 9/11 not being able to do that because it's like, what's going on? It turns out all this other stuff was going on. But today, with GitHub and the current ways, it's really a lot is possible, but you need the social engineering and the team topologies and the empowerment of the teams in order to take advantage of all the fantastic technology that's out there.
I agree with you. When you get to the point where technology continues to grow, technology is it's ever evolving. It goes really, really fast. And because it goes really fast, sometimes, if you don't stop around and look every once in a while, you could miss it. But so since we're talking about future, looking ahead, what trends do you foresee in the future of remote team software development, and how should companies prepare to stay ahead?
It's funny, I tend to think about what are the things that are staying the same, like what to double down on, like invest in onboarding. That's probably good for both. Build long-term relationships. Don't build short-term relationships because things are changing all the time. And the better your relationship is with a team, the more efficient they become and they gain deeper knowledge of the product and the culture. So if you treat it as a long-term partnership rather than transactional, that improves trust. It improves in performance, embracing cultural differences, all those kinds of things. That's becoming more and more understood. I feel like, Andy, you and I were talking to people back when they had never been on Zoom and they had never worked with other countries. And now it's rare to find someone that hasn't worked in that way. So I don't know, there's a lot that's the same. Accountability is the same. But the things that are different, I feel like, are starting things right and having a product mindset rather than a project mindset from the beginning. Because it's very, very different if you're going to be putting products out in a competitive market than if you're just working on an IT project that can go on and on and on. Because being able to ship is quite different. But I see a lot as being the same. It's just you need to up your game when it comes to empowerment and technology use.
Well, Michael, it's been fantastic having you on the show today. Your insights into transforming product teams from mere feature factories into proactive problem solvers have been both enlightening and inspiring. We've learned a great deal about the importance of empowering teams and the strategies to achieve this. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us. For our listeners, if you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating on your favorite podcast platform. Don't miss our next episode, where we'll continue to explore how software is changing the business landscape. See you next time.